Okay, so this is the process for setting up and starting to carve your nameplate. You should have printed out your first or last name in a font of your choice on 2 pieces of regular printer paper. These will eventually use to trace our name onto the slab once we cut it out. To do that, we're going to utilize a template that's already previously cut. We want to lay this down on our slab. We don't want to put it right at the edge because the edge of our slab may not be straight. So we're going to set it in just a little bit, and to conserve clay, because other people would be able to cut their nameplate out of this as well, I'm just going to set it up here. Now the slab I've rolled out, I rolled it out about a day or 2 ago, and I've allowed it to set up and stiffen a little bit. If this slab is too wet, when we go to cut this, your edges end up getting distorted quite a bit. So we want this to be not quite leather hard, where we can't really manipulate it, but we don't want it to be fresh, soft, straight out of the bag clay either. So now that it's stiffened up a little bit, I'm going to hold my template down and I'm going to cut using my knife from my tool bin. Make sure it's clean so that I don't have any ugly edges. When I do this, I want to make sure my knife is straight vertical, not this way. It can be back at an angle this way, but I don't want it tilted to side to side either. Because if I tilt it to the side, when I go to cut my clay, I don't want to undercut my clay in any way, because I don't want this weird angle on the edge of my slab. So I always want to make sure that it's straight this way while it's maybe angled back towards me. So make sure my blade is clean. I'm going to hold the template in place and then use the edge of the template to guide my knife. And I'm always going to pull towards me when I cut and make sure I cut through the template. Then I'm going to turn my slab rather than trying to turn my body. Again, holding my template in place. Just going to cut through all the way. Then turning my slab. Cut all the way down, and then the last cut I need to make. Okay, a slight movement, but that's okay. It just was a small thing that'll clean up pretty well in the end. Okay. So once I have that done, I'm going to want to remove this slab and put it onto something else so that somebody else can use this other side of the slab. So I'm going to use a black bat. Like we did for other assignments, just to put my slab on while I work on it. It won't stick because the slab isn't real wet. So I'm going to lift it up by using both hands, kind of just putting light pressure on the end and tilting it up. And then I'm going to pick it up with both hands. And anytime I movement, I always want to have 2 hands on it, set it on its edge, and then gently lay it down. If we hold it by the end and we pick it up, if I pick it up by the end and it bends, and then I put it down and it bends again, what it's doing is you're starting to stretch the clay where that bend is. And eventually that clay will stretch and it'll start to break. So you see these little cracks in here, it'll start to break, and eventually it'll stretch, and you see this thin part where it's thicker here. So we always want to move it with 2 hands and gently lay it down and set it up again. So once we have our slab cut out, now we can get ready to transfer our name onto the slab. So the first thing I need to do is, using a ruler, I'm going to mark a 1/2 inch border all the way around the outside. So on these rulers, my 0 is set in from the edge. So I always want to make sure my 0 is on the edge of my clay. And then with my needle tool, I'm going to mark where the 1/2 inch is here and here. Then I'm going to move my ruler to the other end. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to mark my 1/2 inch on both sides. Then I'm going to turn it. I'm going to do the same thing at the top. My slab is just slightly bigger than 12, so I'm going to mark my 1/2 inch and my 12 at the top. And then I'm going to do the same thing at the bottom. 1/2 inch. And at this other end, I'm going to mark my 1/2 inch and my 12. What this will then allow me to do is I can use my ruler, that little bit of excess I have where I had my miscut where my template moved. I can then take my knife and trim that even. So now my rectangle is there. So with the marks I made, I'm going to take my ruler and set it down, and with my needle tool I'm just lightly going to trace a line along the edge of my ruler. So I have a nice 1/2 inch border all the way around the outside. Then I'm going to take one of my 2 printouts of my name, and I'm going to line it up inside this border. Once I have it lined up, my paper is going to start to absorb moisture from the clay, so it's going to want to curl up, so I need to make sure I hold it down. Then using my needle tool, like you would with pumpkin carving, I'm going to mark with small dots where I poke through the paper. When I do this, I want to make sure I'm poking outside of the dark line that the printout has. If I do it on the line, when I go to carve, I'm going to end up carving my letters smaller than I want them. So I'm just going to poke through just outside that line so that I can carve away those marks that I leave behind. I'm spacing them out just far enough so that when I do this and I take this off, I can still see my letters, but my paper will still come off as one sheet and it won't leave a whole lot on the clay itself. Okay, so that's one way to trace it. The other way to trace it would be to take your knife, or you could use your modeling tool as well, and you can just trace the outline. You could also probably do it with a ballpoint pen, but I'm afraid a ballpoint pen would tear through the paper. So I'm just going to take my knife, and using the point, I'm just going to trace my line, and it'll leave an indent in the clay where I would have traced it. It's really kind of personal preference which one you want to use. I'd rather probably poke through the paper than do the tracing outline, because once you start carving, sometimes the tracing outline, if you rest your hand on different parts of it, it starts to disappear. It's also not as clear when you're carving all the time as the dots are. And if you want to, you can hold your paper and pull it back, and you can start to see either the dots or the indentation where you started to trace your letters out. Once I've got my name completely traced, I can then take this piece of paper off, and it'll leave that imprint on my slab of clay. This one that I just poked holes in, or you just trace through, you can get rid of. That's why we have our second one. Our second one is going to be there kind of as a reference, so when we start carving any smaller details that are in the letters, we have a reference point there so that we know what it is on here. So when you go to start carving, there's a couple of tools you're going to use. One will be these small mini ribbon tools that come in different shapes and different sizes. So there's circles in 2 different sizes, there's this triangle in 2 different sizes, and then kind of a squared off end in 2 different sizes. What I usually do when I carve these first is I take one of the triangles. I'm going to take the smaller one, and the first thing I like to do is I like to outline my letters. So when we carve these, we're carving the background out. We're not carving the letters out. So I want to take this and I'm going to go into my letter, and I'm just going to, where I poked those holes through the paper, I'm going to carve that outline. It's not going to be very deep, just deep enough so that I know where my letters begin and end. It's kind of a rough outline so that when I start carving out these spots in the middle, I know where not to carve. It kind of gives me a stopping point for some of this. When your clay, the first day or so that you're carving, your clay is going to be pretty soft. So you have to be really careful not to carve too deep into the clay. When it's soft, it's really easy to do that. And if you carve too deep, your nameplate's going to be too thin in spots. And when it's too thin in spots and thicker in other spots, that's when it's more likely to crack. So we want to try and keep our carving shallow to begin with, and then if we need to carve a little bit deeper, it's easier to do that than it is to carve too deep. And then some people have tried to add clay back in, but that never really works out very well. Most people just end up remaking it and retracing it and doing the whole thing over from the beginning. So make sure you're not carving too deep when you first start the carving process. I'm always cleaning out my excess clay from the carving tool. And then these little small areas in between, just being real careful with those. When your letters get real close together, like at this tip of the R and the O, just make sure you're being careful that you don't carve into the other letter when you're doing this. We can always go back and get those tighter spots with different tools, but make sure you're not carving into the other letters when you're going past them. Don't forget the ends, like if you have O's or E's or G's or anything with an interior space, make sure you're getting that interior space carved as well. So in my O, I want to make sure I outline this inside, because I will eventually need to come back and carve that out to match the rest of my background. Now that I have a portion of it outlined, I want to start carving out some of these middle parts. What I don't want to do, so I can use my larger loop tool, and I can go in and I can carve larger sections out. The issue some people have when they use this tool though is they tend to carve too deep into their clay. So I always hesitate using this. I may use it more towards the end to kind of even out my background, and in the meantime I'm going to rely on the mini ones to kind of start taking my clay out. When I do this, I want to carve about halfway down into my slab. And if you're not sure, again, it's always better to carve too shallow and ask if it's deep enough than it is to carve too deep and then have to restart. I've already got the edges carved of my letters, so I just need to carve into that space and get the excess out. And there's some refining of my letters that I can do with the smaller tools once it dries up a little bit more. But this is to kind of get my basis of what I'm going to do everything with. So I'm just going to keep carving like that all the way across. Once I have that consistent depth and the edges of my letters are really clean, then I can decide whether or not I'm going to do a smoother background or a textured background. So in these two finished examples, on this you can see a much smoother background that's fairly even all the way across. And on this one, there is a intentional kind of rough carved out background. For this I used the round ribbon tool, round mini ribbon tool, and I just went in and I just kind of took small areas and made it as random as possible so that I don't have a lot of, it doesn't look like I intentionally made it, but it was all intentional as far as the texture that comes from it. Once it's fired, we'll paint these. So we'll paint our letters, and you can paint your background if you want so that the letters kind of stand out. And then that would be your completed nameplate.